So we're going to be looking at Unit 4 with later Europe and the Americas from 1750, and the time period goes all the way to 1980 in this unit. We're going to see a lot of rapid change take place from the mid-1700s to the 1980s, and we also see innovation, industrialization, urbanization, as well as economic upheaval. We're going to pick up at the end of Unit 3. We saw the work of William Hogarth, and in his Marriage a la Mode, he depicts the young couple that we see here, and this was more typical of the naturalism style, but it kind of took from Rococo with the themes of showing this aristocracy, but now there is a feeling that lifestyle that they led was not one of good morals. And we see that right around the time period before the French Revolution, we have artists like Jacques-Louis David, who creates a work like the Oath of the Horatii. And in this oil on canvas, which is really quite large, we see the depiction of a Roman legend. It was first recounted by the Roman historian Livy, involving a conflict between the Romans and a rival group from nearby Alba. Rather than continue a full-scale war, they elect representative combatants to settle the dispute. The Romans chose the Horatii, and the Albans chose another trio of brothers, the Curatii. And we see here in the painting the Horatii father is got the swords in his hand, and the brothers are taking an oath to defend Rome. Now, it also depicts the neoclassic style, and if we remember, this type of composition was unique in that it kind of harkened back to the simplicity of a classical, almost triangular type composition. And we see opposing two sides, the role of women at the time, as well as the roles of men. In the piece, The Oxbow, this is an American work. We see landscape painting now becomes important. And through the Hudson River School, this group of landscape painters who were based in New York City tried to elevate landscape painting to the status that had primarily been reserved for other themes like portrait. And here we have John Trumbull, who is the president of the Academy of Design. He discovered Thomas Cole. If we recall back to what's going on in the composition, this whole idea of manifest destiny and this taming of wild spaces. On the left-hand side, we have the wild wilderness kind of depicted, and there is the artist also shown very small scale in the foreground. And in the background, we have a more pastoral scene, which is meant to imply that man's kind of taming this land and creating this pastoral scene was somehow ordained, and that the settling of new lands was part of man's destiny. It relates, interestingly enough, to The Valley of Mexico by Jose Maria Velasco. In this oil on canvas, they're illustrating local vistas of the Valley of Mexico, and it also offered an opportunity to highlight these kind of symbols of patriotism that were valuable to this new independent society in Mexico. And you can see some similarities in their majestic depiction of the landscape. Here we have the Stonebreakers, In this work, the artist Gustave Courbet, which you might remember when you did your one-act plays, some of you were chosen to depict the character Gustave Courbet, and he was an artist at the time who was really interested in the plight of the poor. And that's evident here because we see the two figures who are laboring. They're trying to break these stones apart. And it's quite different because they have to use these hand tools. And it kind of suggests that the young man may be a little too young to be doing this type of work, and the old man perhaps even too old, and how this would be kind of the plight of these workers, these stone breakers. And he shows these figures with this kind of gritty realism. He depicts figures who wear ripped and tattered clothing and suggests that they are, in a way, economically trapped. If we look to the work by Rodin that was commissioned by the French city of Calais, he was asked to create a sculpture that commemorated the heroism of this prominent citizen of Calais during the dreadful Hundred Years' War between England and France. The sculpture is interesting because it depicts the citizens as if they wanted to save their lives and their beloved city, then they had to only surrender the keys to the city. Interestingly enough, Rodin was denied entry into the prestigious École des Beaux-Arts, which was a school, one of the academies at the time. Jumping ahead to another notable work from this unit that you also wrote about is Frida Kahlo's The Two Fridas. Here she paints a double self-portrait created during her separation and divorce from Rivera. On the right-hand side, we see Frida in a traditional Mexican costume, and she is also holding a picture of Diego as a child. And on the left is the unloved Frida, dressed in a colonial-style wedding dress. Her heart is broken, and an artery drips blood into her lap. What we see here is a conflict that's implicit in the Mestizo race. She feels neither fully European nor fully Mexican Indian, and it's emblematic of this duality and a cultural divide. Diego Rivera, who was married for a time to Frida Kahlo, was known for his large mural works like this Dream of a Sunday Afternoon in Alameda Central Park. This large mural has a scene that's composed of disparate historical figures from all across time in Spanish history, from Hernan Cortez, who was a Spanish conqueror who initiated the fall of the Aztec Empire, and Sor Juana, the nun that we looked at in the portrait kind of during the Enlightenment period. So all of these figures come together, and he's interested in this idea of the Mexican Revolution and how independence was achieved. If we go on, we're reviewing a piece by Varvara Stepnova. This is the results of the first 5-year plan, and it's interesting in that it's one of the new art forms of this time in 1932, showing a photo montage. So it's a combination of these collaged photo elements, and it expressed the views of the artist at the time. Here, another work that we looked at during the unit was by Vasily Kandinsky, and he was very inspired by music. He was also influenced by the Russian Revolution. Here I've posed a few questions for you to think about. Does art have transformative power? Because he wrote quite extensively on the topics of art and how he did believe that art could transform people. And oftentimes his compositions were titled after musical arrangements, like this one, Improvisation 28. He was born in Moscow, but he spent a lot of his childhood in Odessa. He played the piano, so music, as we said, was a huge influence in his work. At the age of 30, he went to Munich and studied life drawing, sketching, and he started moving into an artistic career. And it turns out that his work moved in a direction that was much more about abstraction than that which was first pioneered by the Impressionists and Post-Impressionists. He was interested in the concept that color and musical harmony are linked. In fact, Sir Isaac Newton kind of felt the same way, that hue and pitch could have this kind of saturation that was similar to the volume of sound. In a work like this, we see very abstract organic forms. It can make you wonder, what does each one represent? And at this time period, are we also having new views of things through microscopes, things through telescopes, and how does that influence the artist's work? So art was displayed at public exhibitions, such as the Salon in Paris, later at commercial art galleries. Museums then became an important institution, part of a representation of civic pride and national status. The sale of art to the public becomes a leading driver of art production, and we see that prices for work goes up, and artwork then becomes a commodity that's appreciated in value, much like someone would collect other objects or the way stocks and bonds could be traded. After the devastation of Europe in World War II, artists in the US dominate the art market. So that's kind of an overview of what takes place with artists like Vincent van Gogh. Obviously, we remember The Starry Night and his use of visual tenebrism in the way he creates this kind of tactile surface to the painting. If we could describe Impressionism and Post-Impressionism, we remember that artists were initially bonded by sanctioned academies, and then they later were looking to have their works included in juried salons. However, this system starts to break down, and they form these self-defined groups, and they establish manifestos and guidelines to their thoughts on art. So change and innovation dominated this era and became goals in their own right. Women artists gained recognition as many artists competed for the admiration of individuality and genius. So we might think of Marie Cassatt, that's one that comes to mind. And we looked at the coiffure in an earlier video that we watched. So we'll notice how her work was inspired by haiku poetry. She was interested in showing the viewpoint of women from their point of view, in that this would kind of show an intimate scene. Church patronage declines, and so now that we have this corporate patronage, she wanted to see people having artwork in their own homes, and printmaking was a way that art could become accessible to more people, and it became more affordable. Artists employed new media, including lithography, photography, film, and serigraphy, which would refer to silkscreen. They used both industrial technology, prefabrication, as well as many new materials to create innovative and monumental works, culminating with massive earthworks like we saw Robert Smithson's Spiral Jetty. Performance was enacted in new ways and recorded on film and video. We looked at the work of Georges Braque and Pablo Picasso. As Cubists, they were some of the main innovators of the Cubist movement, and they began, we see this piece by Cézanne begins that breaking down into planes. And we read an essay about how Cézanne fragmented the space and really led to the Cubist movement. And these are works by both Picasso and Georges Braque as part of the Cubist movement. The idea behind Cubism is to show the essence of an object, displaying it from many different angles and points of view at the same time. So in other words, an object is broken up and analyzed from different perspectives and then reassembled in this abstract form. We also have the introduction of the steam engine and moving pictures. So as things start to move, we see how artists are looking at things from multiple perspectives and multiple vantage points. In his work Les Demoiselles d'Avignon, we see a heavy influence of looking outside of the European tradition to African masks, which are clearly shown in the two figures on the right. So we're going to move forward to the piece by Faith Ringgold. This one was one of those that was included in our last PowerPoint. Faith Ringgold was a great storyteller, and in her works she tells stories of fictitious characters written around her lead, you might say, character, as well as famous people from art history. So her lead character, Rosa Parks, is on her road to becoming an artist and a businesswoman, and she's looking back at the history of art. Jacob Lawrence, with the migration of the Negro, used his gouache paintings to really talk about the clear separation of what's going on with those who are living in the rural South, and they're moving to the industrialized Northeast cities, and that mass relocation that took place from about 1915 to 1950 was, you might say, a key important to be noted about the civil rights movement and how they were treated. If we move ahead to The Jungle by Wilfredo Lamb, we see this work is by a Cuban artist. He moved from Paris, where he met Pablo Picasso, and you can see some influence of Cubist work in his. And he met the poet and founder of Surrealism, André Breton. So he then became interested in the Surrealist movement, and we have this kind of morphing of human animal parts and faces, and some that resemble these African carvings or masks as well. Broadway Boogie Woogie and this piece by Mondrian is part of what's called neoplasticism, or the new plastic painting. He is famous for his essay promoting pure abstraction for the expression of modern life. We tried our hand, if you recall, with watercolor in recreating this piece by Matisse, The Goldfish. This is from 1912. This is originally an oil on canvas. What's noteworthy about this work is the way Matisse endeavors to really push what's happening with color, and he's part of a movement called the Fauves, and the Fauves use these kind of strange color combinations, very bright colors, and he develops a signature style. If we look next at the work of Ernest Kirchner, this is his self-portrait as soldier, and he shows here a severed hand. It's not a literal injury, but a metaphor. It differentiates in important ways from other depictions of wartime amputees because he wants to comment on how they might be abandoned when they're no longer thought of as useful to the nation. So this piece is metaphoric kind of self-amputation, a potential injury, not to the body, but to his own identity as an artist. We remember looking at The Lipstick Ascending on Caterpillar Tracks by Claes Oldenburg and his interest in promoting the idea to make love, not war, and ask you to think back as to where this was displayed and what was going on at the time period. So we see here diverse artists with a common dedication to innovation and these subdivisions of different movements. We looked at neoclassicism, romanticism in some of the landscape painting that we saw, realism like works, for example, by Gustave Courbet with the Stonebreakers. We looked at impressionism, post-impressionism, symbolism, expressionism, cubism, constructivism, abstraction, and surrealism. Abstract expressionism with artists like Jackson Pollock, and pop art, performance art, earth and environmental art. So in our discussion, we're going to talk about different examples of some of these different art movements that stood out from you in your mind from this year.